To begin, I'd like to thank all of you also for joining us tonight for this recognition and celebration of Jean Fisher and her legacy. And I'd like to offer heartfelt thanks to Artist Space for hosting this event. It means a great deal to Jean's family and her many friends and colleagues who could not be here with us this evening, several of whom provided texts of the remembrances you've been seeing projected on the screen, and including those provided by artist Judith Berry, Jean's close friend and colleague, curator Gerardo Mosquera, a frequent collaborator when Fisher was editor of the journal Third Text, and her co-editor on the anthology Over Here, and Cabena Mercer, Fisher's colleague at Middlesex University, who's now a professor of the history of art and African American studies at Yale. In addition, as Harry mentioned, Jimmy Durham sent a short remembrance, and I'll be sharing that at the end of the presentations. For now, I'll again briefly introduce our other speakers. Valerie Smith was curator of Artist Space in 1987 when We the People, the exhibition organized by Jean Fisher and Jimmy Durham, was mounted. And of the three of us here, has the longest history with Jean. Shanna Ketchum-Heap of Birds first met Jean in 2005 on the occasion of Edgar Heap of Birds' exhibition at the Venice Biennale. Shanna later became Jean's doctoral student in 2014. I myself started working with Jean in 2000 while I was editing, together with Simon Lung, the volume Theory in Contemporary Art since 1985, to which Jean contributed her essay, The Syncretic Turn, Cross-Cultural Practices in the Age of Multiculturalism. This evening, each of us will focus on aspects of Jean's work and life that resonate with us, and our hope is that we can offer a glimpse into the vast store of what Jean contributed during her life and has now left to us. I'll start out with a few brief reflections, and then we'll move on to introduce Shanna. As I set to work on these comments, it quickly became clear that it would be impossible to encompass Jean Fisher's rich and generous and sprawling body of work in a few short minutes. As I thought about all of Jean's contributions, my attempts at summarizing proved to be an elusive task, and any one approach impossibly inadequate. Faced with the impossibility of mapping the entirety, I settled on trying to indicate some points on the map in the hopes that you'll be inspired to connect them. What strikes me in the reading and rereading of Jean's texts is her remarkably diverse repertoire of approaches and the effort and creativity she applied to writing about artists' works in forms and registers tailored to each artist. I invite you to look at her website, jeanfisher.com, as a starting point to explore her readings. If, for example, you were to read her essay on artist Willie Docherty's work on the Troubles in Derry, Northern Ireland, and perhaps follow with her essay on Steve McQueen's Photographs in Film, an interpretation of the visual tropes of McQueen's photographs in feature film 12 Years a Slave, illuminated by astutely chosen theorizations of Susan Sontag and Judith Butler, and then went on to read Fisher's interpretation of Maria Teresa Alves's social constructivist art practice in the context of exile and ecology and conquest, and then ended this foray with her essay on Kamal Boulata's work, focusing on Palestinian cultural and political histories and how these are linked to present conditions and reflected in art and resistance. It would be readily visible that Fisher adopts a different and uniquely appropriate form of analysis to each subject. Combined with the universe of sources selected to frame each interpretation and analysis, Fisher's attention to form and style opens up pathways leading not only to parallel readings offered in tandem with the visual, but also extending a clear invitation to us, her readers, to integrate our own experiences into the stream of meanings, as important as any of the ideas she's expressed within. The sum of Fisher's writings emerges out of the confluence of her creative processes, her intellectual curiosity, and her non-negotiable ethical concerns, informed by lived experience. Fisher was never one to confine herself to much of anything, especially in ivory tower. As I mentioned, I got to know Jean through inviting her to contribute to a couple of anthologies I edited. Years later, when I was looking for a doctoral program in visual culture as a mid-career professional, I learned Jean was faculty in the visual culture program at the School of Art and Design in Middlesex University in London. I applied and Jean became my director of studies. One thing that was crucial for me as a point of convergence with my own way of working was Jean's genuinely and deliberately interdisciplinary process and critical approach. Though she chose to refer to herself as a writer, Jean was a scholar and spent decades working in an academic context. Jean Fisher was a polymath. She drew from a multitude of intellectual disciplines and forms without constraints of disciplinary boundaries. This way of thinking as an analytical approach was itself a reflection of Fisher's own disinterest in having her work neatly categorized. Her work was necessarily both cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary. And this question of what to call her and what she called herself and the lack of easy categorization speaks precisely to the nature of her work and to the field, in quotes, of visual culture to which she was linked and which was one of her academic designations. Describing her sources and work process concisely to the outsider, I venture to say, is akin to herding cats. To take this metaphor further, and I indulge it because Jean loved cats, and in fact has a first-person blog on her website in the person of Tootie, her cat. For Jean, she knew a multitude of cats and could summon them whenever she wanted to. Those cats, or categories, were artworks, the living sciences, especially zoology and environmental science, philosophy, post-colonial studies, literature, mythology, museology, curatorial practice, political science, gender theory, media theory, art history, art theory, race theory, Native American and Indigenous studies, Africana and Black British studies, Cuban studies, and so on and so on. This is perhaps why Jean preferred to refer to herself simply as, quote, an artist who practices writing on contemporary art, end quote. It saved a lot of time, and it left her to do the work she was compelled to do in the way that she wanted to do it. To get us to now, with what has Jean Fisher left us? First, the immense and constant dedication, thoughtful critique, and generosity she practiced as a teacher. Her modesty about the importance of her work. Her intolerance of what I'll politely refer to as nonsense. She was direct and sometimes painfully honest, courageous in the political positions she took, and utterly committed to her work. She often worked in the so-called peripheries, considering them more vital, more generative, more productive than the centers. Her consistent attention and commitment was focused on working alongside and collectively with disenfranchised, oppressed, or otherwise excluded from the mainstream artists in the face of an art world that was neither ready nor interested in their work, and by and large, remained so, much to her frustration and dismay. She spent much time working on learning, analyzing, and writing about Northern Ireland, Palestine, and Native America, with interest in bringing to light conflicting national narratives in each place, and crucially, looking for examples of artists' work and practice that had the potential to engage new forms of political agency. She did not believe that art alone would produce social change or correct injustice or halt ongoing brutalities of colonialist or capitalist structures and hegemonies. But she held out hope that art could provide a new way of being in the world that could inspire necessary collective formations that would become agents of real change over time. Her idea of art was as a vehicle for generating alternative and ethical responses. And it is left to artists, activists, and everyday people to disperse these alternative ideas and actively form collectivities that engage in the long and necessarily visionary struggle for justice and the gradual reclamation of our mutual humanity. This is Jean Fisher's legacy, the work between us. Thank you. And now I'm going to introduce the next speaker, Shanna Ketchum-Heap of Birds, who's a citizen of the Diné Navajo Nation and a PhD candidate at Middlesex University, London, in the School of Art and Design. The focus of her research is contemporary Native American art by artists that are socially and politically engaged with mainstream issues from a centered Indigenous perspective. Her publications have appeared in Third Text and the Hugo Boss Prize 2008. Recent lectures were at the Walker Art Center and Nanyang University in Singapore. Since 2007, Ketchum-Heap of Birds has been an instructor in the Native Studies Department at the University of Oklahoma, where she's affiliate faculty in the Women and Gender Studies program in the Center for Social Justice. So I'd like to invite Shanna to present. Thank you.
I just wanted to, first of all, thank Harry and Zoya for having me here. And it's the first time I've met Valerie, so that was very nice, very brief. But first, I just wanted to introduce myself before I start. My name is Shanna Ketchum-Heap of Birds, and I am Navajo, as Zoya said. I grew up on the Navajo Reservation in northeastern Arizona, about 20 miles from an iconic tourist spot known as Monument Valley. When I was thinking about what to write about my friend and mentor, Jean Fisher, I wondered, first, just like Zoya, where would I start? And second, which of her writings most influenced my own work in the area of contemporary Native American art? In the interest of saving time, I will talk about a few of her key writings and then my own research project, which I pitched to Jean back in the fall of 2013 when my family and I traveled to London. In 2013, Jean was Professor Emeritus at Middlesex University, London, and after some reservations about her own health, she accepted me as a PhD student and helped put together a team of supervisors that included Professor Katie Deepwell, an expert on feminist art, and Dr. Richard Hill. Richard Hill was a previous student of Jean's who had written his dissertation about Jimmy Durham's work. And Jean wanted Richard on the supervisory team because he's Indigenous Canadian and has extensive knowledge of First Nations and Indigenous arts issues. As with all things Jean, though, even though she was sick, she always looked out for people and was very generous with her time. One of the most important quotes from one of our email conversations concerned the importance of the basis for studying art in general. Jean told me she believed, and I quote, "Art is the praxis of philosophy." So my study of Native art coincided with our shared interest in philosophy, especially the recent work of Native scholars with PhDs in philosophy. Jean and I spoke about their writings because they often pose critical challenges to the Euro-American analytic tradition and their monopoly on what constitutes knowledge and experience. So we were aligned in the idea that to look at the works of artists, Native and non-Native, one had to delve into the many ways that artists investigated the world and expressed their ideas to the viewers as a philosophical question. Basically, the relation between the self and the other, and how the object mediates this relation. And as a writer myself, I always took this side of the job very seriously. The first time I read Jean Fisher's work was in the year 2003 when I was an art history graduate student at the University of New Mexico. And this is right here is the fall 1992 issue of Art Journal. It was in this issue of Art Journal devoted to the issues, strategies, and content in recent Native American art. Like most young MA graduate students embarking on their career path, I was excited to finally study what I wanted to study, which was Native artists like Emmy Whitehorse, Edgar Heap of Birds, and Kay Walking Stick, whose paintings you saw upstairs, and others who had painted abstractions on canvas like any other European modernist painter. Oh, sorry. And of course, I had studied all of this in art history class. But as I looked around the museums and galleries in New Mexico and Arizona, I noticed the amount of attention that Native artifacts garnered in those spaces with very little attention paid to living Native artists. In her essay titled In Search of the Inauthentic, Disturbing Signs in Contemporary Native American Art, Jean Fisher raised important questions about the relations between Native artists and mainstream institutions. After reading her essay, I was a bit surprised to learn that contemporary Native artists, like the ones exhibiting in We the People at Artist Space in New York City, were met with, and I quote Jean, near total silence from the art press, despite the public popularity of the exhibit. And at that time, the reasons why that happened were fascinating to me. So the rest of my MA program would be defined more or less by what Jean described as the problem. She stated, and I quote, "The work in We the People covered a broad range of media practices, from stone carving to video. What distinguished it, however, was a critical position that not only posed a challenge to Western expectations of what authentic Indian art was, but presented an ethical and political critique of the configurations of neocolonialism experienced by Native peoples." She goes on to say, "Since first contact, Native America has been the object of the feverish stare of the Euro-American and his obsession with collecting and documenting. Through an Elysian of the ways by which indigenous peoples, as active and historical subjects in their own right, perceived or looked back at the European, the writing of Anglo-Indian history has privileged this perspective of the colonizer whose story this becomes," end quote. One of the most important lessons I took from Jean's dissection of Western civilization's fascination with Indians was that every Indian needs to know it, especially those in the art field, because the Euro-American gaze empowers colonial discourses insofar as they form a knowledge of the other that facilitates surveillance and control. Moreover, Jean outlines in her essay, In Search of the Inauthentic, that this object of knowledge becomes fodder for exhibitions such as Primitivism in 20th Century Art at MoMA in 1984, and Lost and Found Traditions, Native American Art from 1965 to 85, which premiered at the American Museum of Natural History in 1985. These exhibitions exemplified what Jean called the persistent institutional reduction of Native American arts to ethnographic spectacle, even though they purported to show the survival of Native traditions. In her essay, The Health of the People is the Highest Law for the Revision's 1992 catalog, Jean writes about how historical arts were again hijacked to celebrate settler colonial culture in the exhibit titled The Spirit Sings at Calgary's Glenbow Museum. And here's a picture of one of the exhibit halls. The Spirit Sings exhibit was a lavish display of historical Canadian and Inuit arts and dubbed as the flagship event of the 1998 Winter Olympics in Canada. It was also the target of many protests and boycotted by the Lubicon Lake Cree, who brought attention to the major sponsor, who was Shell Oil Canada, in order to halt the encroachment of corporate oil interests on their land and economy. Here's actually the picture of the front of Revisions, and it included artists, Joan Cardinal Schubert, Jimmy Durham, Edgar Heap of Birds, and so on, that made work in protest or in response to The Spirit Sings. And when The Spirit Sings opened in Glenbow, there were a lot of protests outside. In fact, here's one image of it, but also here's another image with Rebecca Belmore, who's wearing, an apron with shell on it. And she actually sat outside in the cold for over 12 hours to protest this show. And just some examples of what was seen in the Revisions show. Here's an image of, it's not really Pocahontas' underwear, but it's Jimmy Durham's version of it. And also, here's an image that Edgar Heap of Birds did, a billboard on top of the Walter Phillips Gallery that says, "Imperial Canada doesn't make Indians, Native people recognize themselves." And one more image, Eddie Patra, this is his installation called Small Matters. And there are pages from the book by Dee Brown, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, that have been crumpled and put into tiny fences as though they were in reservation plots. And you can see, I don't have my pointer, but there's this trail of tears there on the bottom. So Jean told me that the title of her essay, "The Health of the People is the Highest Law," was an inscription on a modest library in London and reminded her of Derrida's homage to Nelson Mandela. In his essay, The Laws of Reflection, Derrida describes Mandela as a, and I quote, "a prisoner of conscience who breaks institutional law through his respect for the higher law, that which pertains to justice and is proclaimed in writing from the Magna Carta to the Bill of Rights to be the basis of Western democracy." In her essay for Revisions, Jean describes a Native American as a witness to the violation of the law, because a Native American makes visible what in white democratic institutions never appears, but which is constantly proclaimed, that is, the structure of the law. She also cites the important work of Native scholar Vine Deloria Jr., whose life work was concerned with broken treaties and the effects it had on contemporary Native life. Her analysis still rings true in regards to institutions, and she states in her essay for Revisions, "The museum or privately owned Indian artifact bears witness to history, it is true, but it is not the history of the Indian. It testifies to the history of white conquest, to the disempowerment of Native peoples, to the discrediting of their values as primitive, and to the theft of their cultural heritage. Above all, official emphasis on historical arts throws a veil over the reality of Native Americans as contemporary peoples and their struggles to regain self-determination, self-respect, and a sense of cultural identity." In 2005, I met Jean in a club in Venice, Italy. My husband Edgar and I and half of the art world were in Venice for the Biennale because the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian sponsored a collateral event to exhibit Edgar's memorial sign panels in most serene republics. Jean was there to write an essay, as was Lucy Lepard, for the catalog. It was also the same year that Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore represented Canada in the pavilion. Jean also served as moderator for a panel titled New Contact Zones, in which debates about forms of exchange between Indigenous cultures and the global cultural and political sphere were discussed. The Smithsonian then published this book titled Vision, Space, Desire, Global Perspectives and Cultural Hybridity, that contained many essays, including Jean's and the personal reflections of artists and writers, including myself. At that time, an essay I wrote was just published in Third Text in July of 2005, and it was titled Native American Cosmopolitan Modernisms, an Articulation of Presence Through Time and Space. And like Jean, I was wading through postmodern and postcolonial cultural theory to explore the limitations in regards to the indigenous context. Going back to her essay, In Search of the Inauthentic from '92, Jean rightly criticized postmodern aesthetic discourse for its reliance on theories of cultural difference. She states, and I quote, "Despite the claims of postmodern debate to open a space for the marginal, recent exhibition strategies indicate that this structure remains largely in place. The inclusion of ethnic artists in such shows as the Decade Show of 1990 at the New York's New Museum and Studio Museum suggests that multiculturalism is a new variant of assimilation, a means by which the mainstream incorporates diverse cultural perspectives without essentially relinquishing control." As for the post-colonial debates, it had seemed obvious that one cannot speak of the post in any real sense of the word. Ultimately, as Fisher states in an essay written on her website, post-colonial theory has been criticized for privileging cultural and textual analysis over social, political, and historical realities. So instead, one of the more pressing questions that she deals with in her essay for Vision Space Desire was, how might indigenous subjectivity translate into political and artistic agency in the global sphere? So after kind of going through that little background about some of her writings, I hope I've sort of underscored how important her work was for me and the impact that it had over the years, starting when I was a graduate student. After the Venice meeting in 2005, my husband and I got to London in '07 and saw Jean again and got to visit. I had mentioned wanting to study with her then at Middlesex, but it didn't get to happen. I didn't see Jean again until 2013, although we had kept an email correspondence in the intervening years. But starting in '07, I started teaching at the University of Oklahoma, and I was also writing for various publications, mostly museum catalogs, for what Jean would call rubbish fees. I really like how she put that. And I was also teaching, an inordinate amount for very little pay in a field not my own as well, which was Native Studies. And that's when I decided to start the PhD program at Middlesex. And it turned out that the idea to study as a part-time distance learning PhD student was a great idea, because all my research is in the States. That's where all the Native artists were that I interviewed. And I also get to travel to London twice a year to present my research in oral defenses. When I first approached Jean, I decided I wanted to study performance art because I see such potential in the sidestepping of the European gaze that Native objects and artifacts are subjected to. If a performance artist turns that gaze around and speaks back, I feel like that's a huge step in the right direction. Furthermore, it takes the nature of the debates that gave rise to the We the People to another place. Perhaps we've moved on as Jean had hoped, so that different questions are now on the agenda and capable of enhancing indigenous agency. Central to my research topic was the indigenous content that contemporary artists like Kent Monkman, you see here, Rebecca Belmore in Canada, and also James Luna, pictured here, in Take a Picture with a Real Indian. And later I would add Spider Woman Theater as well, who has the longest running Native American feminist group since the 70s and based in the Lower East Side here in New York City. So I wanted to frame their performance activity, whether it was live performances, installations, narratives, storytelling, video art, within a wider indigenous social and political context focused upon cultural survival, and self-determining agency. I had it in my mind that these artists intentionally used performance strategies to critically engage cultural, social, and political issues inherent to their own tribal backgrounds, experiences, and understanding of pan-Indian community activism. I contended that their performance strategies were not adequately addressed, theorized, or explained by recent strands in mainstream art historical analyses, such as postmodernist and post-colonial frameworks, which I found to be predominant in the literature. Instead, I wanted to explore the works of these artists in terms of the intentionality of their performance strategies to provoke reflections about repressive regimes like settler colonial systems of power that continue to elide the indigenous voice, experience, and lifestyle. One of the ways I sought to accomplish this was by foregrounding indigenous systems of knowledge, methodologies, and discourses when analyzing these artists' works. The desired outcome to me would be to demonstrate the extent to which each artist retains the spirit of indigenous ways of knowing, while engaging performance strategies that allow for the reopening of Western-based paradigms to silenced voices. And my work in this area is indebted to Jean Fisher. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanna. That was great. I'd like to introduce Valerie Smith, curator, art historian, and writer, who is currently living in New York. As chief curator, Artist Space, Queens Museum, Haus der Kulturen der Welt, Berlin, and director of Zonspeek 93, Arnhem, Netherlands, she has worked closely with many artists and architects, such as Annette Messager, Juan Munoz, Ann Hamilton, Nari Ward, Emily Yassir, Shireen Nishat, Lee Ming Wei, Joan Jonas, Amateur Architecture Studio, Inigo Manglano Valle, Jimmy Durham, Javier Teles, Tadashi Kawamuta, Judith Berry, Yuri Lederman, John Kessler, Delaran Scofidio, and Juan Downey. She currently teaches at Barnard College, Columbia University. So Valerie, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks.
Okay, yeah. So, let me track this.
Do you think it works? Okay. I'm just gonna try to juggle a few things here. We're gonna take a little trip down memory lane. 30 years ago, I can't remember anything. Really, it's bad. And so.
There's supposed to be more. There's two documents here.
Okay, so I have to switch. How am I going to do this?
There's supposed to be more than two.
No, that's it.
Okay, cool.
So how do I switch back and forth then?
So if we set these up. Yeah, so this is a PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see, play from start. Do you want to do, and then these things here?
Okay, so they don't see that business.
I know.
Or-
So we could do it this way, that'd be fine.
Or can I just unplug? There's like just one or two things I wanted to show. Or maybe I can show it at the end.
Yeah. You can. Okay, so they're here on the screen. And then we do the slideshows. I'm going to go over it. So if you exit the slideshow, they will show.
So if I exit it,
Yeah.
just like right here?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you'll see these on the screen.
Okay. All right. So, so I'm just going to go through a bunch of slides because we've got 15 minutes here, and we can just sit back and relax. And I'm going to try to remember what happened. I wanted to switch back and forth because I went to the fails where my files are, and I'm saying that I went to the Fales Library at NYU where my old files, because Artist Space took all their files to Fales, and so I have this other source of images that I wanted to show you that are kind of funny. This is one of them. This is a floor plan. Sometimes it's nice to have a bird's eye view of what was intended. It didn't actually happen like this, but it gives you an idea of the old West Broadway space where you walked in, and there was a little reception, and then you have this space which is that was planned to be a kind of ethnology museum, or have this kind of ethnological feeling, atmosphere to it. It's a rectangle room, and Jimmy's work, as you can see, and you can see it at the Whitney. I think this piece or something similar is there. So artifacts, from his piece On Loan from the Museum of American Indian, and sculpted figures. So with these vitrine, it's very scientific-like feeling to it. Some more images. Also, most of the photographic and text-based panels in this room as well are from Richard Ray Whitman, Joe Nevaquaya, Peña Bonita, and Asiba Tupache, where you can, let me just show you this. This is urban, Joe Nevaquaya's piece called Urban Aboriginal Platitudes. And it says in the Uchi language, your butt, your ass, your stink ass, your really stink ass. That's how it translates. So that was kind of fun. From an artist who, as he said, he's tired of being well-dressed. So you have here, I believe, this is where I'm a little fuzzy. In the archive, there's a copper mining collage, Peña Bonita, and Asiba Tupache, I thought was here, but what I wanted to, but I think it's something else here. Taking another look about prejudice, racism, and race relations, there's this wonderful text, which I wanted to switch to. Let's see if I can do it. Is it this one? No, where is it? Hurry. Okay, I just have to go here. Okay. You can just take a look at that ranting, fantastic pages and pages of this wonderful text, taking another look. Okay, so let's see. Can I go back here? No. How do I get back to go? Okay, maybe this is, okay. More of Jimmy's work. His grandmother, Pocahontas' panties. You can see they're bright red, very irreverent artifacts. Then we go into this large, huge space of artist space on West Broadway, and we see Jean Lamar's mural. And the idea was that sh- she usually has students working on this, and wanted, but somehow Artist Space couldn't get it together. We couldn't get it together, and we had, I think it was the Whitney student study program, and they worked on it with her. So you see this, it's really a kind of signature image for We the People. This, you know, this important phrase that Jean, the irony of this phrase, it was taken from the U.S. Constitution, and I think this was super important for Jean to, both Jeans, to present this as a kind of major, that drew people through the kind of more artifact kind of room, the pseudo museum-like space, into this very, and you'll see later in other slides, this gigantic, impressive mural. Let's see. Then in front you have Tom Huff's work. I think, let me see, I have the titles for some of these. Let me see if I have it. So definitely a mixture of the traditional and the contemporary, which is very, I think, very interesting. Playing on the stereotypical and the political. Let's see if I have the, oh, here's the color view. So this bright purple mural, which is quite fantastic. And then then maybe if I can find an overview. Well, we'll have to move along. Peter Jameson, who's Seneca, and I wanted to switch into see this other, well, I won't go into it, it's too difficult, but it's called, this piece is, well, there are several pieces here, but one is called International Lie, and another one is called Actirora Ganon Dagon, Liberty for Sale. This one, Liberty for Sale, and Bering Strait Myth. They're colored grease crayon paper bags, and of course you can see them upstairs. Here's a kind of close-up. Kay walking stick. I think this is called the Yucatan. Harry Fonseca are the paintings. And Jean Lamar here, smaller pieces. And Marcia Gomez, the sculpture. A color shot and bad color shot. So you moved from this kind of pseudo ethnology museum to this living culture space, which is alive with color and movement, and it's more vital, not this kind of dead sort of scientific look. And the idea, which I think we can try to, these are coyote chiefs from Fonseca. Come on, another view. Very bright. This is Apollona, let's see, Susanna Santos, Elders Ceremony, and Primal Dance that has shards of lapis lazuli and crystal stones in it. And maybe here's a better view. The whole idea was to, maybe here's much better. The whole idea was to have a kind of semicircle or a series of semicircles that would create this native concept of a relational world. So there was just with Hoff's piece and with Gomez's piece. And what I like about this is that there's a sense of contemporary art, but also traditional cultures together. And this is, I think, completely unconventional. And Jean was quite adamant about that. I mean, I think for her it was a learning curve. For me it was a learning curve, working together. Also important that Jimmy was there, important that this was giving voice to artists who were working in isolation before, but that was their voice. So really bringing out their ideas, but that it is not just First People's conceptual work, that they somehow were part of this other language that was going on in New York, but that artists from using traditional languages were also involved in this show. So there was a real mix, and documentary practices and poetry and all different kinds of ways of working with stone, with let's see, Gomez is working with Huff is working with alabaster and limestone. So it was very mixed and intentionally mixed. This is, again, another view of more work by Peter Jameson, Civilization, Savagery, Myth. All Indians live west of the Mississippi, Vanishing American Myth, Jeep, Pilgrim, and Cross-Cultural Clash. This is a canvas, oil on canvas, but these are all drawings. And this is Tom Huff. I believe this is Peter Whitman. Yes. Richard Ray Whitman. Do Indian artists go to Santa Fe when they die? This was not in the show, but it gives you an idea where his head was at. I'm having a hard time with these notes. Relocation, assimilation, this piece. And a self-portrait, Homeland series. Alan Michelson's installation, which was separate in a dark room. Oh, sorry. Let's see. Very hard to fathom. This piece, let me see if I can. Okay, here we go. Alan, it's called, this piece was called Up Biblum God. So it was a very complex piece and had many elements to it, as you can see. But essentially it had to do with the Eliot Indian Bible, which has, it's called Mamus Wunit Tupana Tamwe Up Biblum God, Algonquin, it's an Algonquin Bible, and was the first Bible published in the British North America. English, a Puritan missionary, John Eliot, produced a translation from the Geneva Bible and into the indigenous Massachusetts language. So it's also known as the Eliot Bible, but this piece was involved with that whole story. So you have an oxbow cross, and there were also an Indian known blanket, and there were, I think, hides also embedded into this piece, and sand with bottles and feathers, peacock feathers, very hard to photograph. And then there was a video component to it, as to the show. But I thought it would be interesting to see one image that I came up with from the files. How can we move through this or can I? How do I get to the
Second image?
Oh, there are only 2 images, so I can't.
Yeah.
I can't go through the actual.
There are more images?
Yeah, I can't go through that. Can I unplug?
Yes.
Maybe I can unplug. Oops. Okay, so these are some shots from the file, from my file, and as you can see, in the attempt to make a kind of ironic gesture on this pseudo museum of ethnology, in the files we have, get Valerie to check names against resumes, and you have a whole list of Native American nations, languages, tribes. So despite this idea of the irony, we were still practicing this idea of categorization that Jean was so adamant that we get out of. This is not her, this is artist space here. So I just thought this was a little kind of ironic moment in the file. So the list goes on. Anyway, I think I'll leave it pretty much here, and maybe we can have questions. I don't know. I don't know what comes next. So Jimmy's statement then. Because I'm finished. I think we've gone through the images. So yeah. Yeah. This is Jimmy's. This is Jimmy's list from his museum. Okay, what do we do? Just.
What I'm going to do is just read this brief statement, remembrance that Jimmy Durham sent yesterday, and there's a poem that he wrote for Jean that was actually read at an event after her funeral. So, Jean Fisher called me up in about 1985 when we were all living in New York. She wanted to see about getting American Indian artists more visible in the Western art systems. I invited her over to our place, where we quickly became good friends. She wanted to make an art show of American Indian artists' work in the city, but I was against the idea, saying that that kind of separation was just what we did not need. I suggested instead a show of minority artists' work, including many American Indian artists. Maria Teresa Alves and I were involved with artists from Puerto Rico, Mexico, China, and many Black Americans. She did convince me, though, and convinced me at the same time to be the co-curator for a show at Artist Space. Jean was living really illegally then. She worked sometimes at a copy shop on the Lower East Side and could go make her bed only late at night on the floor of the office. Over decades in Britain, the US, and Latin America, so many artists have been helped by her work and generosity. In London, a group of friends met at a pub after her funeral. I could not attend, but wrote the following poem for the occasion. It's called Reading Beds. The beginning will be, is, by the time this is in your hands. Sand's foot grit, weaver beds, names of places in England. I knew an English woman named Hilary Collarbone, but that was in Switzerland. I've never lived in England. Went over for parties, weddings, never a funeral. The wrong people die. Let's drink a cup of kindness, then, for Jean Fisher. Be low limestones, great scar limestones, raven scar group, insect bed, witch beds, shunner fell formation, iron sands, mitten flags, much Wenlock. The names of areas where evidence of life in other times might be found. Pleistocene, for example, or Ordovician, Cambrian even, names which carry heavy baggage of quaintitudism. Even though baggy sandstones, coralline crag, coral rag formation, I could, in fact, intend to continue. Parrot coal formation, see? Farn group, Greta Grit. Oh, get a grip, Greta Grit. Here, in the Anthropocene, some names should not be spoken aloud. But Blue Lias Formation. Jimmy Durham, Berlin, 2017. Thank you for indulging my poetry reading. So I'd like to invite Valerie and Shanna up. We'll pull up a couple of chairs and we'll answer any questions or have some discussion. Perhaps we may have questions for one another as well, but we'd like to open it up to everybody for comments, questions, responses. So just to start off with, are there any immediate questions from any of you or remembrances of Jean or anything? Any of you may have been at the 1987 exhibition. and remember that. I think that would be a small number of people, but I was there, coincidentally.
I think it's important to say that the context, you had primitivism, as Shanna mentioned, and you had, following this, Musicien de la Terre, and this was really in Jean's head. So I think that's what kind of, Musicien was later, but primitivism was really, and then there were a number of other exhibitions that you mentioned that had taken place. So that it was a really ripe time to make this show happen. And it seemed totally appropriate. She came to me and said, I want to do this. And I didn't hesitate because it was what Artist Space was doing anyway, and would continue to do. So it made total sense that it happened at Artist Space. But I think there was a point that somehow with the primitivism show that kind of got lost. And I know people came to her and asked for her advice, but then never really took it. I don't know if you have any comments on that. But it was a tough moment. And there were a lot of people that were up in arms. It was a heady moment to discuss these issues, and they seized it here.
Yeah, just to add to the context, this was, we were in the throes of the AIDS epidemic at that time, ACT UP, Grand Fury. There was a lot of activism happening in the street. Shanna showed the Decade Show catalog cover. I was at the New Museum working during the Decade Show, and it was the quote unquote multicultural moment, and indeed it was an extended moment, but it was a moment, and substantially things did not change, and museums did not adjust willingly any power relations that they enjoyed. And so the Decade Show did not really, it was a disappointment to many people because, you could get in a bus and be taken to Harlem because people, God forbid, regular old, white privileged museum goers were not going to go on the subway to Harlem in that time. We had to get a bus, and the Studio Museum transported people there. So it was a kind of a tourism, an ethnic tourism in a certain way that really, while it was important for it to happen, I suppose, fell far short of what it could have accomplished in that time. And this exhibition here was an attempt to shift that paradigm, but as Valerie said, it kind of fell on deaf ears in terms of really beyond the walls of this space, and also other spaces like the American Indian Community House was doing exhibitions, and Spider Women were out there doing their performances. So, and still are, but those spaces are fairly limited, and certainly not in the mainstream, and that has not really changed. So.
If you read this text, it's like, fuck you, and we still should be saying, fuck you, and we should take Jean, what she's done, and throw it back out and regurgitate it and make it happen again. I don't know. It's not happening, or it's happening a little bit, but not really, and I don't know why this fucking president is still president.
Yes, I want to just give this to Shanna as a question, response to, we have a lot of problems. We've talked about this with bad education for curators and art historians, and horrible. But that we have people that study feathers and come and curate contemporary art and whatnot. But you went to Jean, you sort of jumped ship and went to England to study native art, and I guess in a search for excellence and in a theoretical vein. And how does that look to you now that you sought out Jean? You didn't stay in New Mexico and Arizona or Santa Fe to study this stuff where there's all these bad educators. So you went to a good place, and what they turned out in New Mexico is we're suffering still to this day. I mean, as artists. So anyway, you went to England. So can you say something about that?
Yeah, I think I mentioned in my talk that I did my master's there in New Mexico, and very traditional art history program, even though it was one of the only ones in the country that had Native American art. But the reason why I went to Jean, of course, is because she was dealing with a lot of discourse and theory that was not ethnographic in nature. So it was, like Valerie said, very much critical about the way that Indians were displayed or even thought of. And this was also reflected in the writing. Most of the, I would say, catalogs and books and things that came out about contemporary Native artists were published or made by those same artists. So you really had this sort of avant-garde Native art movement in the 80s without the critical writing behind it. And I really felt like Jean Fisher was the only one dealing with a lot of these issues. And there are, I've been part of small books and catalogs with Native writers writing on it. But just a level of, I would say maybe even the internationalism involved with a lot of Native artists going outside of the U.S. to exhibit in those places. I mean, I think Jean really grasps something way back in the 80s that no one else has picked up. So in a way, going off to London and studying with her was great because she taught me, and so is Katie and also Richard, a lot of the foundational work that I need. So I kind of say it to people that I bring the Indian, but I need the rest. I need the help. I need the art history. I need the discourse and the theory to reframe a lot of what's been done. And I think I mentioned in my talk that I was really interested at that time in learning about this European gaze and which is really foundation of European desire in showing Native art, but that only takes you so far. You need to understand that, but as far as breaking new ground and bringing out the strategies that a lot of the artists still from the 80s haven't been served yet, then you need to look elsewhere. So ethnography, anthropology, all of those things, you have to sort of get out of that, I think, as a writer or even someone studying Native art, is you just need to know it, but it's not very helpful to me. So seeing something like We the People, or even the American Indian Community House Gallery stuff, even out in Davis, UC Davis, they were great because I was there. I felt like I was alive too, so to study these artists was important because there's no voice. It's been very much silenced and still is, I believe. So, even Edgar went off to the Royal College of London, and I think a lot of people do go off elsewhere. I'm thinking of like James Baldwin, I felt like that, like I had to get out of this area and go search for something else that was kind of more open theoretically and foundationally to accepting a new vision of contemporary Native art. And luckily, Jean was there to help.
Thank you all for your comments. I think this has been really interesting. And I was just thinking myself, as someone who works in more traditional art of the United States and Latin American art, about just the implications of some of the global issues that three of you have been talking about, and the globalization of this study. And I guess looking forward, how you see relations with Canada or with Latin America, or how does that operate in terms of your thinking about the future of the field?
Is that for you?
Do you want Shanna to take that in relation to native in relation to native scholarship going forward? Is that what you were getting at?
Yes.
Okay.
So where we go from here, is that the question?
But also in terms of, thinking about the Americas more broad, you're sort of mentioning Jean as being part, looking at the Caribbean, looking at Latin America. So how do you see that as a possible thread for the future in terms of the studies of indigenous peoples? I mean, in contemporary art, do you see that as one possibility, or?
Well, I think it's a really great idea. It's sort of difficult because when you're talking about indigenous peoples of this hemisphere, I mean, they all have different languages, separate voices, concerns, relationships to their own communities. So I think that one of the ways I've dealt with it in my own writing, in my dissertation, was just sort of dealing with the activist side of it. What are the issues that are central to not only Indigenous Canadians, but also Native American and in Central America. And one of the things I'm writing about actually is the missing and murdered Indigenous women in this hemisphere. And to me, that's a very, important issue that's global as well, because it's not only in the Americas, it's elsewhere. So the idea of looking at practices and ways that artists deal with them separately. They all do different things. Rebecca Belmore, also Teresa Margolis, what she did in Juarez about the issue. So to me, kind of uniting behind this activist front is something that Jean also talked about as well. And I think it's a really important, it's a new look, it's a new way of looking at this work that also brings out specific issues and also challenges sort of the relationship between the local and the global. So, and of course that can be inflected through, Deleuze and Guattari, minority literature, et cetera. But I think the main idea is just to keep this kind of activist stance and to find agency for each one of those indigenous communities. And that's how I dealt with it. Well, Zoya, you want to talk about Cuba? You did.
Yeah, well, yeah, I've done a lot of work in Cuba, but I think that just to bring it back to Jean's work and her legacy, that it's very much about the local. It's very much about what you do to create agency, to reimagine situations that need to be addressed, that need to be changed collectively. And those local situations may have intersections with other local situations. And in that case, that's an opportunity for what Jean, talked about, the kind of collective dispersal of activism and of ideas that are art is the seed for those things. That particular artworks can help to inspire those kinds of collectivities to form. But I think it's really important not to lump things together and lump cultures and groups of people together because they're indigenous or they're Latin American. I think one has to always be mindful of the local contexts and histories and put them in a global context as it can apply. But you always run the danger of overgeneralizing and kind of losing the focus of what's happening, and people not really understanding why? How is the situation different, in Cuba versus in Puerto Rico? How is the situation different with Cubans here and Cubans on the island, for example, and how does that art production differ? Even within Miami, you look at Miami and it's you can't really lump anybody together because there's a lot happening and there's a lot of cross-cutting and feuding and competition and all kinds of different ideas about what should be done. So I just really want to focus, keep the focus on being mindful of local realities and local politics and seeing how those might intersect to form coalitions with other like-minded artists elsewhere.
Thinking that this reminds me of the problem with the Magiciens de la Terre exhibition, where you did have some similar concerns, global similar concerns, but the whole exhibition homogenized the individual voices. And they didn't come out. Everyone was sort of lumped together, I think, is the idea. And their voices, the impetus for the exhibition didn't come from within. So I think that's something to think about in terms of exhibition making. Is how do you present if you're going to do because every artist wants to be known not from who they, what their culture is. They want to be an artist, and that's it. I want to show my work. I'm not because I'm Peruvian or a woman or so on and so forth. But how do you keep that integrity and that individuality without, in a big exhibition where you're dealing with lots of different issues. So I think Magicien was interesting in that respect of what not to do, in a sense, what they tried to do and where it failed.
Any other questions?
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you so much for such informative and inspirational panel. My interest in We the People exhibition comes, I guess, out of my interest in artist space and its role in the kind of diverse and global New York art scene in the 80s. I write about South Korean pro-democracy protest art, which was shown only 10 months after We the People show, in the title called Minjung Art, which means people's art. So people could mean different things in different cultures and histories and social revolutions. I have two questions. One is, why do you think Jimmy Durham agreed to then put a show of indigenous art instead of minority artists in New York City? Is there anything that you know, Valerie, or anyone could speculate? And what was the type of public popularity that the show garnered versus the silence in the art press that you mentioned, Shanna, that perhaps did not really resonate in the art scene as we now see in 2017. I wonder what type of public popularity we had in '87, and how it could have resonated with today. Thank you.
Well, what I know about the popularity was that, as Jean said, that there was really word of mouth, that a lot of people in the community that knew these Native artists especially going back to the American Indian Community House Gallery and other places, that there was a lot of interest in people coming and seeing the show. As far as why there was such silence, I think, and arguably there still is, I think, as Jean said, that there's just this conflict between how to display and show Native art without silencing the voices that are in there. So instead of showing, just a whole bunch of artists together and showing ethnographic material and sort of writing about it as if they're still in the past and they're just barely surviving, that doesn't really help in giving a political position or a subject position for Native people here today. So I think that's why, as she said, the art press didn't know how to deal with that or write about that. I believe in one of her, I think she said that Thomas McEvely did write a few years later about the problem. And I know that in Canada, I showed stuff about revisions, there was a huge blowout. Because of revisions, there were anthropologists, writing back and forth to each other in the Anthropology Today for a couple of years, some for and some against The Spirit Sings. I believe the numbers were that there were like 1,600 pieces of ethnographic material from Europe. And some of those institutions actually took them back. So I think the protests and the really helped, around that particular exhibition. But as far as why Jimmy Durham didn't invite other people, maybe Valerie would know.
Well, I wasn't really privy to those. I mean, I wasn't the director. I was the lowly curator. I know, I probably shouldn't say this, but I know that Jimmy, I see Jimmy regularly, and there was a rift with the director. He had a big rift with the director. I know it was really a hard thing, Edgar. You had an idea about what it should be, and I guess Jimmy and Jean had another idea. So I think they struggled with it, how the exhibition should be and what it should be. I know their attempt was to show lots of different indigenous voices from around the U.S. I mean, sometimes these things are just kinds of experiments, what it is, what you can make it. In the correspondence, there were people who were asked that didn't make it. Some people barely made it. It was very difficult to pull it together. These things are, fluctuate and have lots of different issues around them that are not just financial but are personal. I think it was just a learning curve for everyone. But it actually, I think, it was really great. I mean, I think they did something that was worthy. I mean, here we are, so we can learn from it. Some other ideas?
I have one question, if it's okay to jump in. I mean, something that's been on my mind is, and just really following some of your closing remarks, Shanna, about epistemology and how indigenous knowledge systems, how Jean led you to think in that way. But obviously, Jean was a non-native writer, thinker, and curator, and working in a way as a sort of path-breaking Native American curator, I'm wondering how, and I think also today that might be, we might be uneasy with the idea of, or that there's certainly a lot of tension over the idea of epistemological colonization or tourism, to use a word that you use, Zoya. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit on how Jean navigated those tensions and how, that I think that model is rich and that those problems are so real today in terms of dealing with artworks of cultures that aren't your own. So I'd love to know more about your experience working with Jean in those terms.
Okay. Well, I think one of the things Jean, the reason why she put Richard on my committee is because she wanted to avoid feeling like she knew everything about Indigenous people or art, which is great because you need to have that representation, I feel. And in all of our conversations and even emails, she would always say, I'm not Indigenous, I don't know that, but let's think about it this way. And I think that was great because we were both interested in Indigenous ways of knowing, whether it was phenomenological or whatever. I think one of the things that really shows in her writing is her writing about the trickster and the coyote, and especially as it relates to Jimmy Durham. But with Jean, it was great because that idea of the trickster or the troubadour or the clown, that's something found in a lot of other cultures. So you have like the monkey, you have the rabbit, you have all these things in other cultures. So for her, she didn't focus just on one, but she was always respectful in trying to talk about it from her position. So I think I was interested because I studied philosophy as an undergrad. So I was interested in art theories back then, but we also shared an interest in philosophy of literature. So the idea of the trickster, I feel like, is a really good example of her just sort of expanding outside. And her practice of looking for artists that push those boundaries and challenge those positions, whether for political reasons, ethical reasons, just the idea of resistance and pushing back. So she was very critical of European modernism and just about every other thing that I could mention. And I really liked that because not only are you sort of from this other outside position like I find myself in when I was studying art history, but also the idea that there's a lot of knowledge to be known and had and ways of seeing that people different from yourself will offer. And I think she was really open to that. So she was a great teacher in that sense. Yeah.
I wanted to respond to what Valerie mentioned. I really applaud the show that Jimmy and Jean put together. And Valerie showed Richard Ray Whitman and Joe Dale Nevacoya. And I wanted to just mention that was a cooperative group in Oklahoma in the 80s called Makers Alliance, and there were 5 of us together. And then Jimmy had work here, and we had the show at the O. Westbury, where Jean curated that show for SUNY. And then that show was brought to Oklahoma. And one of the wonderful things about our mission, and I have to say that I guess we're cultural workers. I think that's kind of what our jobs are. We're artists and we're curators, but we're really cultural workers. My brother right here is very big on that. You can tell. He's making this thing happen here in artist space. So that's your gig. And so we brought it to Oklahoma, but we put a medicine woman in the show from the Cheyenne Nation who could actually take you through the ceremony, take you through and save your life. And she beaded cradle boards. Her name is Patricia Mousetrail Russell. And we could put her in the show, and bring all of her giant wealth of knowledge, which is amazing, and have her interact with this work. So there's all these great kind of marriages of ideas that are possible, but it's really built on being a participant, not a topic or subject, you know, and I think that's what we're looking at. And I hear good things from Artist Space now, how they're doing performances upstairs and music and all these things are happening. They're participating in this show that's upstairs. So they're not just having a topical six-week run somewhere, you know. And I think that's what we're really looking for as a very good future. Kathy was asking about the future, and I think that's a good middle ground to talk about. We're in the middle of that point where we're actually going to keep progressing forward to let the Native and indigenous artists participate in this whole culture, not be just subjects of it, you know, like in a collection or in a catalog or in a book, and have that be more proactive. And I go back and forth about that because I think, I don't know what the artists feel like today in this room or the curators, but you know, it'd be nice if you could just curate a show or just make art, but you can't just stop at getting the book, the essay and the PR out for the world. You got to do a lot more work on this on these efforts today because it's so hard to educate everybody. So I think it's a bigger job we have, but I like what's happening here a great deal with Artist Space.
I totally agree with you, Edgar. I mean, that's the way I like to work. I mean, if you're not going to be there and do the work and be there from the beginning to the end, then. But we're talking about, what, 87? And so, and I know a lot of the artists didn't show up and barely got it together. So perhaps, you know, your idea, what you had for the show was different and would have been a nice element to it. Why that didn't happen, I wasn't privileged to know about. But, you know, there was this experiment, and it's now important to move on, as you say, and do other, you know, expand it, improve it, understand it, and go further with it, much further. And I think there's totally room for that, and not only just stick within, you know, one culture, but you know, open the dialogue, you know.
Hi, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this idea of work and activism and where that, in terms of holding institutionals accountable and demanding more representation as opposed to cultivating community. I know that's a balance, but in these times of resistance and increased activism, it seems like a tricky thing to want to demand, but be positive and not to resist the institutions in such a way that you might actually be held back or deny working with an institution because you don't believe in the politics, to navigate that moving forward.
Well, I guess from personal experience, I gave a talk at the Walker Art Center in the summer, and that was a pretty big protest going on there. But, you know, Jimmy Durham's show came from the Hammer Museum, the one that's at the Whitney now, and came to the Walker. And months ahead of it, you know, my husband and I were asked to speak at the opening, and I wanted to talk about Jean's work with Jimmy because she had passed, you know, the December before. But, you know, and at the same time, Sam Durant had his sculpture outside that dealt with the history of executions in America. And I was sort of in a funny position because I had written for Sam's work a few years before that at the Massachusetts College of Art. And it was actually the one about the Pilgrim story ended up in the Guggenheim. And so I was in this terrible position because, of course, there were a lot of Native people protesting. And I felt like they should, like I felt like that's good. And it was coming up, and we went there and spoke, and I sort of deflected, and I was like, I'm just going to talk about Jean and her relationship with Jimmy. But it was a really good dose of like reality, because there were a lot of Native people going on Native America Calling, protesting about Jimmy, saying that he's not Native American, he's not Cherokee. And I was surprised someone actually dug up his Ancestry.com genealogy stuff. But I think it's a really good example of what you're talking about, especially with the local versus the global. Is he's not in Oklahoma. He hasn't been for a long time. He's elsewhere. And as I said, people think that he's not Cherokee. And so we get this question at the end of our talks, and I didn't know hyperallergic was in the audience, but but I thought about Jean, and how what she would think, and she would be just sort of like, well, nothing's new. Of course, that's gonna happen, But I go back to what she told me, is that, that art is an investigation, and it doesn't hinge upon your identity. Because if you're going to be categorized that, especially about that by institutions, then that's ridiculous. And so people that didn't want his work to be in the museum, my whole thought was, it's 40 years of somebody's work. If they can make that, then they can say something about it. But, that's a lot of work for an artist, no matter what background, that they should have that recognition. And then on the other hand, and where I'm from, which is a reservation, which, we're Indian, we have Indian cards or whatever. And, we benefit a lot from that. So that really goes against, what Jimmy stands for, which is the, non-policing of Indian identity. But I have grandmothers and family members that make baskets and rugs and sell it or trade it for food. That's why I'm here. So I kind of feel like the whole question, as it deals in a Native American context, is a very privileged position to be in. Like, we can sit here and talk about art all day and talk about theories, but it's really, I find like it's a very privileged position to be in. And I'm kind of glad that, the artist space flew me out here to talk about it. But when you get down to like the grassroots people that were in Minneapolis, if we don't have that, then, and especially the traditional people, the medicine people, if we don't have them, then we don't really have a culture to even talk about. So that kind of gives you an example of how I kind of go back and forth as a writer, but also someone from a community, trying to write about Native art or think about it as well. But I think the institutional aspect that Jean talked about a lot, which is where a lot of her criticism was aimed, was very important, because she sort of unraveled the fact that at the end of the day, those institutions are still in power and nothing has changed. So we need to think of new ways to do things.